For this album quest, we are zeroing in on the results from round 1, group 2, and 23. And we had 4 incredibly diverse contenders fighting for those 2 precious spots.
Very diverse.
First, Tears for Fears' surprisingly contemporary album, The Tipping Point. Then, the aggressive, sort of genre-blending Broadcast to the World by Zebrahead.
Okay.
Then you have the canonical compilation Smash Hits on vinyl from the electric pioneer Jimi Hendrix. And finally, a 1986 compilation LP called Formula 32.
And the rankings are why we're here. I mean, they just defy convention and expectation, which immediately suggests there are these profound underlying criteria at play.
Absolutely. Lay them on us. What was the final order? Okay, so the final order was Tears for Fears. They secured a decisive first place. No real contest there.
Okay. In second, unexpectedly, was the compilation, Formula 32.
Wow.
Then, in what I think is a genuinely shocking turn, Jimi Hendrix's iconic Smash Hits landed in third place, so it just missed qualification.
It's out.
It's out, and Zebrahead came in fourth.
Okay, we have to unpack this immediately. That ranking, Formula 32, a mixed bag compilation from 1986, beating a seminal, foundational, pioneering rock icon like Jimi Hendrix. That's not just surprising. I mean, that's controversial.
It really is.
It suggests a major bias in the listener's criteria, perhaps toward, I don't know, production quality or specific arrangement styles, rather than historical significance. It does, and that is precisely the mission of this album quest, to understand the specific arguments Greenstocks used to justify this ordering. We have to focus really heavily on the measurable criteria. Production quality, emotional resonance, and crucially, the inherent limits imposed by different recording eras and formats.
Yeah. We're going to look at 4 wildly different records and try to determine why one's sheer density of hits trumps another's artistic genius when judged by a contemporary critical ear. Let's not waste any time, then. We have to start with the surprising second-place finisher, the one that beat Hendrix.
I'm really intrigued by Formula 32 right out of the gate. As you mentioned, it's a compilation LP from 1986. And that era, it was kind of the peak of cassette and CD popularity. But vinyl still ruled the compilation market for, the dedicated fan. The author immediately flags a technical issue specific to this format. It has 16 pop and rock hits crammed onto a single 45-minute vinyl record.
And this demands a real technical look because the physical constraints of vinyl mastering and the compromises you have to make for commercial reasons are absolutely central to understanding why this album performed the way it did. In analog audio engineering, especially when you're preparing a vinyl master, you face this critical trade-off. It's known as the density-fidelity paradox.
So break that paradox down for us. What's actually happening when you try and cram 16 songs onto a disc that's traditionally meant for, maybe 8 or 10?
Well, the core principle is simple physics. To fit more time onto one side of a vinyl record, the mastering engineer has to physically cut the grooves closer together.
Okay, they're squeezing them in.
They're literally squeezing them in, reducing the pitch or the density of the groove windings, and critically, to stop the needle from just jumping out of the grooves, especially during dynamic, loud passages, they also have to significantly reduce the dynamic range of the music itself.
So that means compressing the sound.
Yes, compressing the sound. You're effectively making the loud parts quieter and reducing the difference between the loudest and softest signals. And that just, it compromises the overall sound fidelity.
So the producers of Formula 32, they were clearly prioritizing a pragmatic commercial decision here. It's about maximizing the volume of content. They're giving the listener their money's worth in terms of minutes and number of hits over preserving pristine audio quality.
Oh, absolutely. It's an economic choice, masking as an aesthetic one.
Yeah.
It's a calculation based on retail value, not audiophile perfection. They're maximizing playtime at the expense of potential fidelity and, dynamic punch.
So you expect it to sound pretty bad then?
Well, this is what's genuinely fascinating, and it's really a testament to the mastering engineers of that era. The author noted that this decision, though compromising, didn't actually have a huge detrimental impact on the overall sonic quality.
Uh-huh.
The record seems to have held up surprisingly well, which suggests the engineering compromise was managed skillfully enough to remain acceptable to a modern ear.
But it's never perfect. The source does cite one specific exception, which I think always helps to illustrate the limits of the format. The Ultravox track, Vienna, reportedly went slightly off-pitch towards the end of side 1.
That detail is highly illustrative. That flaw, It could be just general wear and tear, which happens with heavily played vinyl. Especially 80s pressings, they weren't always manufactured to the absolute highest standards.
Sure.
However, it also strongly suggests a tracking stability issue. As the vinyl side approaches the center label, the physical speed of the needle across the groove actually decreases relative to the rotational speed.
Oh, right, because the circle is smaller.
Exactly. So tracks pressed tightly in that center area are inherently more sensitive to playback flaws, like a worn stylus tip or a turntable that isn't perfect. If the original fidelity was already compromised because of the density, those flaws would likely be amplified where the tracking is weakest.
It's amazing that the technical constraints of the physical medium, the rotational speed, and the groove width are still influencing a modern listener's ranking in this way.
It's a huge factor.
But technical flaws aside, we had to look at the content. I mean, a compilation lives or dies by its track list.
And this track list, despite that density challenge, is anchored by truly undeniable, bona fide classics of the mid-80s rock and pop scene. And this concentration of quality is really what gave it the competitive edge.
I mean, look at this lineup. You've got Queen's I Want to Break Free, Elton John's I'm Still Standing, Rainbows All Night Long. You even have Tears for Fear's own Shout, which is really important context for later. Dire Straits' Walk of Life, Roxy Music's More Than This. These are just era-defining songs that even in a slightly compressed vinyl form, they instantly lift the compilation's overall quality average to an extremely high level.
They're classics precisely because the composition and the production were just impeccable. Even Compromise, those songs are monumental. But as with all compilations, the producer has to fill the gaps.
Right.
And that brings us to what the author calls the dubious inclusions. The tracks that feel like they were maybe included because of publishing deals or tracks that represented a more an acquired taste.
And that list includes Nick Lowe's I Love the Sound of Breaking Glass, Tom Robinson's 2468 Motorway, and that undeniable novelty hit Ian Dury and the Blockheads' Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick.
Precisely. And while those tracks are historically interesting, they don't possess that universal, timeless appeal of the main hits.
Yeah.
They require a certain specific appreciation, or they just simply haven't resonated with the contemporary ear as strongly as the headliners. The author notes that these inclusions detract slightly from the compilation's perfect score.
So it demonstrates that even just 2 or 3 weaker tracks can be enough to slightly reduce the overall competitive average of an album quest entry.
Absolutely.
Before we move on, we can't ignore the naming mystery here. What exactly is Formula 32? The name itself is so generic. It's a perfect encapsulation of 80s commercial compilation culture, isn't it? The author's musing is totally valid. Is it a formula for musical success? Or is it just the 30-second iteration of some massive localized series, perhaps mirroring the now franchise structure?
Yeah, like now that's what I call Music 32. Exactly. And that ambiguity just highlights that these records weren't sold on concept or artistry. They were sold purely on the aggregated track list printed on the back. The name was just disposable packaging.
So, despite the technical compromises inherent in cramming 16 songs onto a single LP, and despite the few tracks that kind of fell flat, the sheer concentration of professionally produced, high-quality 80s material meant that the average quality was high enough to secure second place. This shows that breadth of excellent material can overcome the singular brilliance of a pioneer, which is a big statement about this listener's criteria. It suggests that consistency and a high professional polish, even across various artists, provides a competitive advantage over what we find next. The lowest ranked entry, Zebrahead, which suffered from issues relating to execution and persona, it suggests that consistency and a high professional polish, even across various artists, provides a competitive advantage over what we find next. So let's move to the bottom of the rankings, the 4th place album, Broadcast to the World by Zebrahead. Now, the author was unfamiliar with the band, which is actually great for analysis because it removes the entire weight of nostalgia.
Right, it's a clean slate.
It's a pure, unclouded discovery effort. They were an early millennium punk/rock outfit, and the notes suggest they sounded, quote, almost exactly as expected.
And that expectation is rooted in the early 2000s rock zeitgeist, which was really defined by hybridization. This was the moment where pure pop-punk energy, exemplified by bands like, say, Green Day and Blink-182, began to aggressively blend with the vocal and rhythmic textures of nu metal acts.
Or the rap rock thing.
Yeah.
Totally. The sources cite a shopping list of influences. Green Day, Alien Ant Farm, Blink-182, Silverstein, Taproot, and significantly a large chunk of Linkin Park.
And we need to delve into that Linkin Park connection because it really defines the specific vocal structure of that whole era. That style normalized the dual vocal delivery. The clean melodic vocalist paired with the scream or the rap delivery, often using screaming during certain lyrical passages to maximize aggression and impact.
Absolutely. This technique was vital for bands that needed to straddle that line between the melodic appeal of pop radio and the aggression of the metal scene. Broadcast to the World, which was Zebrahead's sixth studio album, exemplifies this mix.
The author notes tracks like The Walking Dead and Rated R for Ugly lean heavily into the heavier middle side. They feature that characteristic low-end chunk and aggression. Then you have Anthem, which is flagged as being more straightforward, high-tempo punk rock.
Okay, so the band successfully navigates these styles, and the album is described as being solidly produced. So if the musicianship and production were sound, what exactly relegated them to last place? This is where the critique gets intensely subjective.
It all comes down to performance, and specifically vocal delivery and persona. This is the part of the source material that it demands the most careful attention. The author highlighted a very specific, almost theatrical vocal tic observed in some American punk bands.
Which is?
The tendency to sound like they are using a noticeably awkward or bad English accent. It's a style of pronunciation and inflection that, for this listener, detracted significantly from the emotional sincerity of the performance.
That's a fascinating layer of criticism. So it's not about hitting the notes, it's about authenticity or perceived affectation. It is. And the analogy used is, as you said, unforgettable and highly specific, comparing Zebrahead's vocals to Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins. Wow. That's rough.
It is. And for anyone unfamiliar with that reference, Dick Van Dyke, while a brilliant actor, is famous for delivering one of the most notoriously terrible Cockney accents in cinematic history. It was broad, inauthentic, and often unintentionally comical.
So to apply that comparison to a modern punk rock band suggests that the vocal affectation, the way they choose to deliver the lyrics, it became a significant enough flaw to break the immersion and just pull the whole ranking down.
Exactly. The listener is being thrown out of the musical moment by a vocal tic.
So when the host speaker of Zebrahead, Matty Lewis, is paired with the co-lead vocalist and rapper Ali Tababe, the attempt to convey raw, high-energy aggression sometimes slips into this affected, almost theatrical register that the author just found jarring.
Yeah, and this spontaneous question the author asks, whether bands that sound like Dick Van Dyke constitute a subgenre that passed him by, that tells us just how distracting the vocal performance was.
But let's expand the musical analysis a bit before we accept the vocal critique wholesale. Did the source detail how the dual vocalists interacted musically? I mean, were the transitions between the clean and screamed parts smooth, or did they feel disjointed?
No, the transitions were effective, and it showed solid production, but the source does imply that the overall lyrical substance was also somewhat generic. In the two heavier tracks, The Walking Dead and Rated R for Ugly, the lyrical themes are relatively standard, rebellion, angst, heavy aggression, which is pretty typical for the genre. The critique wasn't that the music was bad, but that it was generic. It lacked the distinctive maturity or the complexity of the top contenders. So the final summary on Zebrahead is this. Solid production, effective genre mixing, but ultimately, the material was generic. And this highly specific subjective flaw regarding vocal personality was enough to prevent Broadcast to the World from competing successfully against records that offered either extreme emotional depth or an overwhelming volume of classic tracks.
Yeah.
It was simply the least compelling entry in a really tough group. Now we arrive at the biggest surprise of the entire group. Jimi Hendrix's smash hits coming in third place, failing to qualify. Being beaten by a compilation LP from the 80s, we have to dissect this fully because it challenges everything we think we know about judging musical legacy. It really does. This album quest result forces us to distinguish between historical importance and contemporary resonance. Smash Hits is a foundational document of early rock. It was first issued in the UK in April 1968.
Yeah. And it served a vital function back then, collecting all four of the Jimi Hendrix Experience's seminal singles, plus their B-sides, along with 4 key tracks from the UK edition of Are You Experienced? It's a snapshot of his formative, groundbreaking genius, so we have to acknowledge what this compilation is and what it is not. Crucially, it predates some of his later masterpieces. The notes point out that famous tracks like All Along the Watchtower and Voodoo Child, Slight Return, are absent. They came later.
Right, but it absolutely includes the cornerstones of his sound, Purple Haze, Hey Joe, and Foxy Lady. And the author provided a typically nuanced track-by-track assessment. He appreciated the discovery of 51st Anniversary, a track he hadn't encountered before. However, he expressed a strong dislike for Stars That Play with Laughing Sam's Dice, despite acknowledging that the background guitar work near the beginning was awesome.
Oh, okay, so again, this shows the listener's acute ability to differentiate between pure technical performance, I mean, Hendrix is playing, it's untouchable,
Yeah.
and the overall quality or resonance of the composition.
Precise.
But the core argument, the historical critique that structurally relegates this album to third place, that's what we need to focus on. The author contends that Hendrix was simply too far ahead of the rest of the curve.
That is the heart of the matter. Hendrix was the inventor. He was literally building the architecture of virtuoso rock guitar in real time in the mid to late 60s. The argument is that because he was forging a path, some of his material, when you listen to it 5 or 6 decades later, after every subsequent rock band has built upon his foundation, it sounds inherently more raw or, yes, even primitive compared to the highly refined rock wave of the 70s and 80s.
Wait a minute, I have to push back on this, because isn't the argument that Hendrix was too far ahead fundamentally unfair? Shouldn't we credit the pioneer for setting the groundwork regardless of how polished later artists became?
Well,
This suggests a strong bias toward modernity and a highly specific definition of what constitutes polish.
that's a critical point, and it's the exact tension the author is struggling with. The bias is acknowledged. It's the difference between hearing the invention and hearing the refinement.
Right. A modern listener, having grown up on the refinement, might perceive the original invention as lacking certain qualities they now associate with good rock music. And this leads directly to the primary technical limitation identified in the source, the rhythm gap. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for anyone who understands arrangement and production constraints. Unpack the rhythm gap for us in detail. What forced Hendrix into this specific type of arrangement?
So the Jimi Hendrix Experience was a power trio. Just Jimi on guitar, Mitchell on drums, and Noel Redding on bass. Crucially, there was no second dedicated rhythm guitarist.
No rhythm anchor.
Exactly, no rhythm anchor. This forced Hendrix to take on this gargantuan, almost impossible role. He had to handle all the lead, the effects, the feedback, the textual exploration, while simultaneously being responsible for maintaining the necessary rhythm part and underlying harmonic structure.
And the consequence of that setup is just profound in terms of arrangement. If you drop the rhythm, the entire song structure could just fall apart.
Exactly. The arrangements were constrained by this necessity. Those incredible extended guitar heaven sections, the soaring, frantic, improvisational solos we associate with his genius, they had to be, as the source notes, chosen carefully and sporadically.
So they were short, contained bursts.
They had to be. He couldn't fully lose himself in the improvisation for long stretches because he had to immediately transition back to holding the rhythm structure in place. The result is a sound that feels incredibly dynamic, but perhaps lacks the continuous, dense backing of later rock.
Let's contrast this sonic result with later bands who solved this problem through specialization in technology. I think the source mentions AC/DC, which is a perfect example.
It's a perfect example. If you listen to the sonic difference, it's stark. In AC/DC, Malcolm Young's role was pure, unadulterated rhythm, guitar thick, tight, relentless, and unforgiving.
He used the engine.
He was the engine. That rhythm provided a continuous heavy meat to the sound, and this specialized role gave Angus Young the ultimate freedom to just elaborate on his frantic solos, knowing that he didn't need to hold it all together at the same time. The sonic texture is dense and robust.
And this ties directly into the evolution of studio technology and the definition of what the author calls clinical production.
Precisely. The 60s sound of Hendrix, while heavily studio edited for the time, still retains so much of that raw, live-in-the-studio feeling. By the 70s and 80s, later virtuosos, Van Halen, Brian May, Michael Schenker, they benefited immensely from sophisticated multi-track recording and layering.
So define clinical production for us in this context. What does that mean to the listener?
In short, it's production that utilizes the full potential of multi-layering, separation of instruments, and equalization that became standard in later decades. It allowed a dedicated rhythm track to be laid down and maintained, often doubled or even tripled for thickness.
Right.
This freed up the lead guitarist to then overdub complex, soaring, extended lead parts, creating a much denser, layered, and what the author refers to as clinical sound, meaning sharp, separated, and highly polished, with every part having its own defined space.
And Hendrix just couldn't achieve that level of layered complexity in a live trio setting in 1968.
He couldn't.
So the author's final assessment, it acknowledges Hendrix's undisputed genius, the wizardry, the inventive riffs on Purple Haze and Foxy Lady, but the internal conflict is whether his taste, which was developed on later, more specialized and clinically produced guitarists like Schenker, Gilmore, Page, whether his taste simply found Hendrix's output too jammin' and less clinical.
And the author concluded that they might simply be a sucker for clinical production. This is the key takeaway for understanding the Group 223 ranking. The foundational limitations of early production, particularly that rhythm gap created by the trio format, clash with the listener's developed preference for modern sonic polish.
It illustrates perfectly why a foundational classic, judged purely on current listening experience and production criteria, might fail to progress in a personalized album quest.
Yeah.
So for production limitations and performance issues relegated the bottom two, what elevated the winner, Tears for Fears' 2022 album The Tipping Point, to the clear top spot. This has to suggest flawless execution, high production standards, and immense emotional resonance.
It checks all those boxes. The Tipping Point provided the highest mark of execution, sophistication, and emotional maturity in the entire group. And it also benefited from a perfect benchmark comparison since the group already contained TFF's classic Shout on the Formula 32 compilation.
Oh, right. So he could judge their current work directly against their own classic history?
Exactly.
And this album is steeped in significant personal weight, which so often translates into genuine artistic depth. It was 5 years in the making, and the central themes are undeniably dark and somber.
They are. The themes are deeply serious. They represent the state of mind of Roland Orzabal following the passing of his wife during the writing process for a lot of this material. And this anguish and seriousness, they aren't just thematic. They infuse the actual sound of the record. It gives it an emotional texture that none of the other contenders, a compilation, a punk album, or a historical best of, could possibly match.
So let's analyze how that serious tone is musically manifested, starting with the opener, No Small Thing. How does that track set the stage for this mature sound?
It's masterful. The lyrics are metaphoric yet intensely expressive, coupled with this calming overall mood that suggests reflection rather than, explosive anger. Musically, the author focused specifically on the excellent use of the guitar riff.
How so?
It doesn't dominate. Instead, it kind of bubbles under the surface of the track, only just breaking through in moments of climax.
That technique-restrained power, that's a hallmark of mature production, isn't it? It builds tension and resolution without relying on cheap dynamics.
It's highly sophisticated. It shows they're choosing texture and nuance over just sheer volume. The author even wished the technique had been extended further, which shows you how profoundly effective that specific, restrained musical choice was in establishing the album's emotional architecture.
It avoids the bombast of earlier TFF work, like Shout, opting instead for depth.
Yeah.
Now, despite the prevailing gravity, the album isn't entirely monolithic. I assume there are necessary dynamic contrasts of emotion throughout the track list.
Yes, and My Demons is noted as a key exception. It temporarily bucks the trend with a slightly higher tempo, quick-witted lyrics, and a stylistic nod to their earlier, more Baroque and orchestral work, like Sowing the Seeds of Love.
Okay. But that temporary burst of energy is swiftly followed by a return to the prevailing solemnity. And this seriousness is powerfully personified by Orzabal's vocal delivery on Master Plan, particularly that specific raw line, I need a lot of rage to get by these days.
Oh. That lyric just captures a sense of emotional exhaustion and raw honesty that immediately resonates. But the emotional pinnacle, the track that truly secured the victory, was the centerpiece, Rivers of Mercy. The sources suggest this song alone might have been enough to lift the entire album above its competitors. The praise for this track was just overwhelming. It was cited as providing an intensive emotional experience. It features gorgeous vocal delivery and arrangements that incorporate these silky, expansive harmonies. The author specifically praises the Peter Gabriel-style bass intro, a deep, textural, pulsing groove, which immediately signaled high-level production and complexity. And crucially, the author deemed it, quote, a quite beautiful song and probably one of the best songs I've heard in a few years.
That kind of immediate, high-impact emotional and aesthetic resonance is the ultimate currency in an album quest. It's an instant classic for the listener, which naturally catapults the album to the top tier.
And this complexity and sophistication led the author to a significant, spontaneous genre reclassification.
They classify The Tipping Point as prog rock, right? And they mused whether all Tears for Fears albums have ostensibly been prog rock all along. This is fascinating because TFF has always been filed under new wave or, like, sophisti-pop.
And the author's point is highly insightful. This classification isn't just about complexity, it's about intent. Prog rock, at its heart, is about thematic depth, structural complexity, ambitious scope, and sophisticated production that often prioritizes texture and nuance over simple, conventional pop structure.
And the tipping point, dealing with grief and existential questions, utilizing complex arrangements, and demonstrating restraint in its dynamics,
Yeah.
it fits that definition far better than the commercial pop label they typically wear.
Exactly. It's an album that rewards deep, focused listening, which is exactly what the album quest demands. So the final verdict is conclusive. The tipping point is a beautifully produced and elegantly executed effort, a class above the rest. It wasn't just a good album. It was an album that created a sustained emotional pull, making the listener want to return to it repeatedly, which is the ultimate indicator of its #1 rank.
The flawless, emotionally intelligent execution just easily overcame nostalgic weight, sheer hit density, and even the pioneering genius of the rest of the group.
That sustained engagement is the metric that trumps all others in this format. An album that demands and rewards repeated, focused listening will always win the album quest.
So looking back at Group 223 of this album quest, we've seen a powerful demonstration of how contemporary listening criteria can reshape the hierarchy of musical history. We analyzed the technical compromises inherent in vinyl density and how the sheer volume of high-quality hits in Formula 32 secured a strong second place.
We saw how the Millennium mashup of Zebrahead was ultimately derailed by the subjective critique of vocal personality and, frankly, generic execution despite sound production. And most critically, we broke down why pioneering genius like Jimi Hendrix, operating under the structural limitations of 1960s recording technology and the absolute necessity of the trio format.
Specifically, that technical constraint of the rhythm gap.
That rhythm gap, exactly. Why that was ultimately judged less resonant than the highly sophisticated, mature, and clinically produced execution of a contemporary record like The Tipping Point.
What this group review truly reveals about musical taste is that the pursuit of perfection, or rather the pursuit of sonic polish, often outweighs historical significance for the modern critical ear.
Yeah.
The listener, self-aware about their preference for clinical production, ranked the albums accordingly. The detailed breakdown of Hendrix's rhythm gap is the perfect illustration of how structural necessities of a past era become critical flaws when viewed through the modern lens of sound engineering and genre specialization.
It is absolute proof that an album quest, as designed by Greenstocks, is not purely about historical importance. It is about direct, emotional, and sonic resonance with the listener in the present moment. Production standards and emotional execution matter immensely, sometimes more than the invention itself.
Yeah.
The sheer maturity and flawless execution of Tears for Fears, driven by raw personal anguish, provided that sustained engagement the listener was seeking.